The thing about being a hero is that it makes people assume you want to be useful. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of the heroic character, or at least of mine. I did not survive the drain by being useful. I survived by filling out forms in a sandbag bunker while better men died in the mud above me, and by the time the smoke cleared and someone needed a senior castigator to stand in the right place and look authoritative, I was available. That is not heroism. That is scheduling. The distinction matters enormously to me, if to no one else. The commendation had arrived on my desk 11 days after the engagement, on official ecclesiastical paper with the Fifth Army header and the colonel's seal. 400 words describing a man I did not recognize carrying out actions I did not recall performing, in a sequence that bore an approximate relationship to events I had witnessed, in the way that a painting of a battle bears an approximate relationship to an actual battle. The general shape is correct, but the blood is the wrong color and nobody is making the face they actually made. What had actually happened, for the permanent record that no one will ever see, was this. Sergeant Major Holt had been hit in both hands by shrapnel from the secondary detonation and had turned to me because I was the closest upright body and had pressed the detonation cord into my grip and said, "Krell, pull that," and I had pulled it because the alternative was explaining to a man with bleeding hands why I needed a moment to consider my options. The sluice gate had blown. The flood had done what floods do to things standing in culverts. The assault creatures had, most of them, been knocked off their feet and carried into the drainage chamber below, where the remaining section of Holt's 9th had finished them with grenades and field artillery in what the official record describes as a coordinated combined arms engagement, and what I would describe as, primarily, gravity. I had been holding a detonation cord and standing near the result when the dust cleared. That was my contribution. Gravity's contribution was considerably more significant, but gravity does not have a service record and therefore cannot receive a commendation. The commendation said, "Castigator Krell, acting under extreme duress, demonstrated decisive initiative at the critical moment of the engagement." Decisive initiative. I kept a copy framed above my field desk. Not out of pride. There is nothing in that sentence worth being proud of if you know what it actually describes. But as a reminder. The institutional record and the lived experience are not the same document. The gap between them is where careers are made and where accountability goes to become something more manageable. I have lived in that gap for 20 years. It is a useful address. The increased dispatches began arriving in the 3rd week after the battle. A decorated castigator generates paperwork at approximately twice the rate of an undecorated one. Requests for speeches at regimental dinners, testimonials for subordinates seeking their own commendations, consultative opinions on tactical matters I had no business opining on. I signed them all and added nothing. An opinion that commits to nothing is an opinion that cannot later be held against you, and the form of words I had developed over 2 decades. The situation appears to warrant further consideration. The evidence at this stage is suggestive rather than conclusive. I defer to the relevant operational authority on this matter. These are the administrative equivalents of standing still in a field. You are present, you are technically functional, and nothing you have done is the reason anything went wrong. Colonel Esther and Voss did not share my appreciation for managed non-committal. He summoned me on the 42nd day after the battle. I know the number precisely because I had been counting, in the way a sailor counts days in port, measuring the distance from the last danger toward the next. Voss's office smelled of pipe tobacco and old decisions. He was a lean man, the colonel, the kind of lean that isn't about physique but about 20 years of the war wearing away everything that wasn't essential. His face had been eroded by bad weather and worse news until only the structural elements remained. 2 eyes that missed nothing, a jaw that had opinions about integrity, a mouth that opened only when it had something specific to say. He had never, in my observation, said anything he did not mean. I found this alarming in the way that genuinely competent people are always alarming. They make you worry that they can see through you, and then you worry that your worry is showing, and before long you are sweating through a field uniform for reasons that have nothing to do with the ambient temperature. He did not look up when I knocked. He was reading, holding the paper close to the lamp in a way that suggested either poor light or words he was reading very carefully. "Krell," he said. "Sir." "Close the door." I closed the door. The closed door was the first specific piece of information the meeting had offered, and it was not encouraging. Voss received most subordinates with the door open, which means their conversation is ambient, part of the command post's background, filed under the general category of things that happened today and are therefore recoverable. A closed door meant a closed record. No adjutant taking the minutes, no duty log, no subsequent paper trail leading from this room to this conversation to whatever Voss was about to ask me to do. Which meant that whatever Voss was about to ask me to do was not something that appeared in my official orders. And things that do not appear in official orders do not have an official paper trail, which means that if they go wrong, the official record contains no evidence that anyone told anyone to do anything, and the only person in that situation who bears any accountability is the person who was asked and then did the thing. I sat down without being invited. This is a calculated act, not an oversight. Sitting uninvited suggests comfort, and comfort suggests confidence, and confidence is the performance I have been sustaining since before Voss was a colonel. It costs nothing, and it works sufficiently often that I have made it habitual. "You noticed the maker's mark," Voss said. It was not a question, and it was also not the opening I had been braced for, and it landed in the room with the particular weight of a sentence that has been held back for several weeks and is now arriving with accumulated intent. The maker's mark. 3 interlocking hammer rings. A double serif on the lower bar. The stamp of the Aldric brothers' Foundry, Industrial District, Moulhaven. I had seen it on the chest casing of one of the assault creatures 42 days ago, while standing in the mud and smoke of the drain's aftermath, with the bodies of Holt's 9th still being counted around me. I had looked at it for 4, perhaps 5 seconds, in the specific register of a man whose mind is cataloguing information while his face is performing something appropriately solemn. And I had walked away. I had not written it in my report. I had not mentioned it to anyone. I had placed it in the mental filing cabinet of things I know and have decided not to know, and I had locked that cabinet and put the key somewhere inconvenient. Voss had evidently been looking through my filing cabinet. "I may have observed something consistent with that description," I said. The administrative hand held 8 inches above the fire. Technically, the hand is not on fire. "You observed it, and you left it out of your report." The post-action report addressed the tactical and command elements of the engagement. Forensic assessment of equipment markings seemed outside the scope of a summary document. He looked at me then. The full weight of those 2 eyes. I met them with the equanimity I have spent 20 years calibrating, the expression of a man who is content with his choices and has thought carefully about them. "Someone very senior," he said, "wants to know whether Church Foundry iron is ending up in Hell's war machines, or whether Hell has been reproducing Churchmaker's marks on its own work. Either scenario is a significant intelligence failure. Both require investigation. You are going to go to New Antioch and investigate." There it was. Delivered without preamble, without ceremony, without any of the administrative softening that makes unpleasant assignments slightly less unpleasant. Voss did not soften things. Voss gave you the thing directly, which I respected as a professional approach and found personally inconvenient. The calculation ran before I had consciously started it, because the calculation is always running. Distance from the front. Moulhaven was 40 miles east, which was encouraging. Nature of the work. Archival. Investigative. Fundamentally a paperwork problem in a city, rather than a battlefield problem in mud. Risk assessment. A senior castigator with a commendation ribbon going to examine a licensed foundry in a functioning city that the church controlled. The fighting was 40 miles west. The probability of being shot at was, in most reasonable scenarios, low. In most reasonable scenarios. "I'll want to cross-reference the regimental supply manifests before I depart," I said. "Review the Ordnance Commission's transit records for the relevant period. 3 days of preparation should... You have 3 days. I've assigned you an escort. Corporal Okafor will be ready at 0600 Friday. Okafor. I noted the name. An escort was a complication. Someone who would watch me, which is never ideal, but also a practical consideration, in that an escort is, in the event of something going wrong, a body that is, definitionally, positioned between me and the thing that is going wrong. What specifically am I to report on? He slid a document across the desk. I opened it. Requisition numbers, dates, weights, 40 tons of iron casings. A delivery diversion, 6 months prior, from the Aldric brothers' Foundry to a transit facility in a place called Calveaux, rather than the standard military depot at Fort Alden. I want to know where that iron went, Voss said, and I want a report I can take upstairs. Upstairs. I noted the word. Voss did not usually look upstairs. He was a man of the horizontal, the line, the rotation, the supply chain, the immediate operational reality. When he looked upstairs, it meant someone above him was already looking, and someone above him was not generally looking, unless what they were looking at had already exceeded the normal administrative containment threshold. "I'll be thorough," I said. He nodded once and looked back at his paper. I had been dismissed. I walked out through the command post, through the sandbag corridor, through the plank-floored antechamber where the duty staff were managing tonight's signal traffic. I stepped outside and stood in the grey afternoon air. The forward position existed around me. The familiar smells of mud and latrine and cold canvas, the sound of distant guns maintaining their background correspondence, the organized chaos of a military installation that has been in the same location long enough to develop habits. 40 miles from the front, a foundry, paperwork, the kind of mission that on paper posed no particular risk. I went back to my desk and began to plan, with considerable care, the report I would write when I returned. The report that would satisfy everyone and implicate no one, that would confirm the investigation had occurred and produce no specific information about what I had found, that would exist as a document of professional competence without being a document of institutional liability. That was the plan. Then I went to the Ordnance Commission archives and pulled the supply records and spent 3 hours understanding exactly how much I did not yet know. Corporal Desta Okafor was at the motor pool at 5 minutes to 6 on Friday morning. Not at 6. At 5 minutes to 6. Already there, engine running, map folded to the correct section and laid flat on the bonnet. 2 days' worth of travel rations secured in the cargo area, papers organized in the door compartment. This was not a person who arrived on time. This was a person who was always already finished arriving by the time you got there. She was perhaps 32, with the physical economy of someone who had learned, through extended practice in unforgiving conditions, to conserve energy for the moments that actually required it. Her uniform was correct in every particular, not the polished correctness of parade, but the maintained correctness of someone who understands that appearing professional is a layer of institutional armor and therefore worth maintaining. Her expression, when she looked at me, was neutral in the specific way that neutral expressions are deployed to manage the visibility of other expressions. "Castigator Krell," she said, "hero of the drain." Perfectly flat. Not reverent, not sarcastic, not warm, not cold. Just the title, delivered with the vocal inflection you would use when reading a label off a crate. The paperwork somewhat overstated the situation, I said. Most paperwork does. She picked up the map, folded it, tucked it under her arm. 7 hours to New Antioch if the Valley Road holds. 9 if it doesn't. Checkpoint at the Alden crossing. Church patrol, standard procedure, shouldn't be a problem. I have papers for both of us. Of course, she had papers for both of us. She had been doing this before I arrived and would be doing it after I left. And the fact of my presence was, from her perspective, a logistical addition to a journey she was already managing with complete competence. I noted that she had not asked what we were doing in the Moulhaven District, nor had she asked why a castigator with a fresh commendation was being driven 40 miles east by a single corporal escort rather than a formal detail. She was either very good at not asking questions, or she already knew. Given the quality of her pre-departure preparation, I suspected the latter. I climbed in. She climbed in. We left the forward position at exactly 600, and I watched the command post diminish in the side mirror and felt my shoulders drop approximately 2 inches, which is what they do when the nearest artillery is receding rather than approaching. The rear areas unfolded in the first 40 minutes. We moved through the secondary support zone, the logistics installations and signal depots and maintenance facilities that exist to service the thing at the front without being the thing at the front. An ecclesiastical supply column, oxen pulling artillery limbers, the drovers wrapped against the morning cold, moving west toward the front with shell casings and prayer ammunition and the look of men who know exactly where what they are carrying is going. A cluster of votive lancers bivouacked in the ruins of what had once been a chapel, their mounts picketed along what had once been the nave wall, the horses' breath misting in the morning cold, and the lancers themselves performing the 1,000 small maintenance tasks that constitute military existence when not actively engaged in military activity. Checking equipment. Eating. Not looking up as we passed. 3 sets of road wardens in the first 15 miles, checking papers at impromptu checkpoints with the practiced efficiency of people who have done this until the checking of papers is a motor function rather than a cognitive one. Okafor produced our documents each time without being asked, passed them through the window, received them back, drove on. She had done this journey before, evidently, or something very like it. "How long at the command post?" I asked, after the second hour, when the landscape had opened out from the suppressed, blasted terrain of the forward areas into something that looked, almost, as the world had looked before all this. Brown fields, bare trees in rows along the road, a farmhouse in the middle distance with its windows intact, which I noticed because intact windows felt unusual, which tells you something about the degree to which the war had recalibrated my sense of the ordinary. 8 months, she said. Before that? Forward observation. 6th Artillery Battery. Forward observation. Calling in fire coordinates from a position at the edge of what your instruments could resolve, which meant the edge of the area your instruments were directing fire into. The margin of safety for a forward observer is the margin of accuracy of your own artillery, and the margin of accuracy of artillery under battlefield conditions is a statistical distribution rather than a precise guarantee. To survive forward observation for any extended period required either exceptional skill at positioning, exceptional judgment about when a position was becoming untenable, or both. "Caldwin's Ridge," I said. She glanced at me. Once. "You've read the operational summaries," she said. "I read all the operational summaries. Occupational reflex. The 6th lost 63% in 40 minutes. A flat recitation, the way you state a fact that is outside the range of normal modifiers. Not proud, not grieving, just measuring. I was one of the 7 who walked out. 7 from approximately 20, depending on the precise composition of the battery at the time of engagement. I knew what had come through the fog at Caldwin's Ridge, or I knew the official version, which described it as a significant demonic incursion, and I knew the unofficial version, relayed to me by multiple officers over the weeks following, which described things that the Church's standard classification vocabulary was not entirely equipped to name. I knew what survival of that meant in terms of what a person had been inside and what they had carried out. "I'm sorry," I said. "For what?" A genuine question, not defensive, not performative, genuinely asking. "For Caldwin's Ridge." She thought about this with the consideration she gave to everything. "Caldwin's Ridge was 6 months ago. You had nothing to do with it, and you can't undo it. Are you going to keep apologizing for historical events, or shall we discuss what we're looking for in the Moulhaven District?" I opened my briefcase, spread the relevant papers across my knees, and we discussed Moulhaven. New Antioch arrived before the Moulhaven District did. The first sign wasn't the walls, it was the smoke. We were still an hour east of the forward checkpoints when Okafor glanced at the horizon without expression. I'd already seen it. A dark stain spreading across the sky like ink pressed into dirty linen. Not the black grey of shell bursts or the white haze of gas, but thick, industrial, unrelenting. The kind of smoke that meant something was burning on purpose and had been for years without stop. The walls resolved out of the haze over the next 40 minutes. 20 meters of dressed stone, reinforced at intervals by towers that have been counting themselves since before anyone alive was born. 77 towers in total, each one named, each one carrying a specific legend about a specific siege that the city survived and the enemy did not. The walls have never been breached. In 300 years of war, in a conflict that has swallowed armies, drowned generals in the mud of its own ambition, and reduced the ecclesiastical cartography of 3 continents to a series of contested lines, no enemy has ever stood inside these walls by force. The church is not modest about this fact. Set into the stonework at heights that would require scaffolding to reach, the anchorites watched. Metallic battle shrines, each containing a devoted warrior who had made the irreversible decision that service to the city was better accomplished from inside a metal housing than a body. They do not sleep. They do not look away. Some of the older ones have votive offerings piled at their bases. Dried flowers, personal effects, small coins pressed into the mortar by hands that believed the gesture would carry forward to something that could receive it. The city's people still pray to them, or at them, or around them. The theology is, I suspect, deliberately flexible. The gates were iron, 3 meters thick, faced with church iconography carved by someone who had apparently found the human form insufficient and decided to address this by adding more eyes. The Duke's livery flanked the guard posts, blue as the sea and red as blood, which sounds poetic until you see it in practice and realize it mostly looks bruised. The guards checked our papers with the thoroughness of men who have been told that failure to check papers has consequences, and the professional disinterest of men who have found no cause for action in any paper presented to them this year. The bureau seal on Voss's travel authority made them straighten slightly and wave us through. Useful. The bureau exists, in part, to make situations exactly like that useful. Inside the gates, New Antioch introduces itself without ceremony. The noise, foundry hammers, the bass rumble of something very large on wheels, artillery workshop thunder that the body cannot quite convince itself is safe, canal freight whistles, vendors, priests arguing about something with the focused energy of men for whom argument is a professional obligation. The smell, smoke primarily, but beneath it, hot metal, chemical baths, river water, food stalls, thousands of bodies. New Antioch at any given moment houses more people per square meter than any comparable city in the faithful territories, because New Antioch requires bodies the way a foundry requires fuel, constantly, with no particular concern about how much of the fuel is left when the process is done. Great bronze statues stood at intersections throughout the city, each depicting a figure in foundry leather, hands raised. The city's memorial to the thousands of workers who give their lives each year in accidents and overwork, a fact that New Antioch marks with statues rather than policy changes, which tells you something about the city's priorities and everything about its relationship with the people who make it function. I had walked past one of these statues on my way out 7 years ago. I passed a different one as we drove in. Same posture, different face. Possibly the same year's worth of dead, just memorialized in a different location. A column of Abyssinian warriors moved through the cathedral quarter, the Kaitet, answering their 7-year call to arms, traveling 6 weeks to serve a war that exists 4,000 miles from home because the Church of New Antioch asked them to. They had the look of men who had decided not to find any of this remarkable. I respected that. It takes a particular endurance to travel that far for someone else's crusade and not let it show. At the front, nobody believes they're winning. In New Antioch, the walls have never fallen, and that foundational fact generates belief in the way that bedrock generates ground. If the walls cannot fall, the war can be won. If the war can be won, the work means something. The people here manufacture certainty alongside their ordnance. It is the city's other industrial product, and considerably easier to produce. I had grown up inside that certainty. That was probably why I recognized it so quickly for what it was. The city arrived the way industrial cities always arrive. Before you see it, you smell it. Coal smoke first, the permanent signature of large-scale smelting, acrid and pervasive, then hot metal and the sulfurous byproduct of industrial process, the smell of things being transformed at high temperature into other things. Then, as we crested the ridge east of the valley, the visual, a serration of chimneys and forge towers against the overcast, the skeletal frames of crane rigs that stood over the industrial quarter like the architecture of something vast that had reached up toward the sky and found nothing there and simply stayed, arms extended, waiting. The Moulhaven District had been, before the war's third year, a quarter of ecclesiastical manufacturing with a significant commercial element, the kind of place that made things in quantity for God and commerce in roughly equal proportions, since both institutions have similar requirements for raw material, organized labor, and reliable transportation. The canals ran through the industrial quarter with the certainty of old infrastructure, carrying finished goods east and raw materials west, and along the canal front, merchant houses had done their commercial theology for 100 years. The church had come in the third year with authority and urgency, and a great deal of ducats, and had commandeered approximately 40% of the city's manufacturing capacity for military production. The merchant houses along the canal were now war procurement offices. The larger commercial foundries were producing church ordnance. The city had adapted with the pragmatism of an industrial settlement that had always understood that its prosperity depended on contracts, and the largest available contract was now the Crusade. It had the look of a place that had not been bombed, but was continuously prepared to be. Sandbag revetments around the major foundry buildings, stacked with the careful bulk of structures meant to absorb rather than deflect. Emplacements on the higher rooftops, some of them manned and some of them empty in the lax way of emplacements in a city that has not been attacked recently and is beginning to believe it won't be. 3 church warden checkpoints on the main approach road, which waved us through on the strength of Okafor's papers and my rank insignia with the bored professional efficiency of men who check papers 1,000 times a day and have long since ceased to be interested in what the papers say. The Aldric brothers' foundry occupied a full block in the eastern industrial quarter, backed against the canal. It was a serious building, not ornamental, not aspirational, just built with the honest intention of lasting. 3 stories of smoke-blackened brick, iron-shuttered windows at the upper levels, a main gate wide enough for a loaded heavy transport with room for a man on either side. The sign above the gate was old wood with gilt lettering, faded but precise. A. Brothers & Co., Est. 347, licensed ordnance manufacturers by authority of the Holy Ordnance Commission. Below the text, the maker's mark. 3 interlocking hammer rings, a double serif on the lower bar. I stood on the pavement opposite and looked at it for perhaps 30 seconds. "That's the mark," Okafor said. Not a question. "That's the mark." The mark I had seen on the chest casing of the assault creature, in the mud and smoke, 42 days ago, which I had not written in my report. We crossed the street and went in. Aldric Vane was not what I had modelled. I spend considerable professional effort modelling people before I meet them, because the gap between the model and the reality is where negotiations go wrong and where I get into trouble. And I have found that the better I can narrow that gap in advance, the fewer surprises I encounter when closing it. My model for Vane had been third-generation foundry owner, military contractor, therefore pragmatic, therefore composed in the specific way of men whose income depends on maintaining workable relationships with the institutional authority that issues the contracts. A man who had spent decades managing church officials would have some facility for managing them. He might be guarded, perhaps, or strategically cooperative, but not frightened. What I found was a man in his late 50s, heavy-set in the way of a man who had once been physically powerful and whose body had renegotiated that arrangement over time without fully surrendering the frame it implied. He wore a good suit that had been lived in hard. His complexion was the complexion of someone who had been sweating continuously since at least Tuesday and possibly longer, a general high color that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with internal weather. He held himself with a particular stiffness, not the stiffness of formality, but the stiffness of a man who was working very hard to keep his body from communicating what his mind was currently experiencing. He met us in the Foundry's administrative office, which I recognized immediately as the workspace of someone who understood filing without enjoying it. Ledgers on shelves, spines labeled in an even hand. Manifests in stacked wooden trays, each tray with a paper marker identifying the year and category. The kind of careful organization that means everything is exactly where you left it, even if no one else can locate it, because the system is in the organizer's head and the files are merely its physical expression. Not so different from my own arrangements, which I found vaguely reassuring in the way that recognizing a familiar structural approach in someone else's work suggests a shared professional language. He shook my hand. His palm was damp. His eyes went immediately to my commendation ribbon, then to my face, and the expression that crossed his was complex. Relief and anxiety in the specific combination that occurs when the official who has arrived to investigate you turns out to be a human being with identifiable credentials rather than the faceless institutional consequence you had been dreading. "Castigator Krell," he said. His voice was steady enough, but carried the slight, controlled quality of a voice that has decided to be steady. "I've been expecting someone. I didn't know it would be. I mean to say, I've heard about the drain. Of course everyone has. The Fifth Army Bulletin." "Vain," I said. "Let's sit down." He sat. I sat. Okafor took a position near the door, slightly to the left, from which she had a clear line of sight to the room's full width. She did this every time we entered a room. I had noticed it in the customs office at Calveaux and in every subsequent indoor location. Not paranoia, professional positioning, forward observation habits. "I'm here on a war procurement audit," I said. "I'll need your production records, shipping manifests, and requisition orders for the past 14 months. I'm particularly interested in any deliveries redirected away from the standard depot at Fort Alden." "Calveaux," he said. He said it immediately, before I had finished the sentence. The word coming out with the specific relief of a confession that has been building pressure for long enough to require only the smallest invitation. "You know about the Calveaux diversion." "I know about the shipment." He put both hands flat on the surface of the desk, a gesture I read as an attempt to anchor himself. There were aspects of it that were not standard procedure. I know that now. I knew at the time there were elements that were unusual. But the requisition was legitimate. It came through the War Procurement Office with the correct seals on the correct forms in the correct sequence. In my experience, when a properly sealed requisition arrives from a War Procurement Authority, you don't... He stopped. "You don't ask questions. That is not how the relationship works." "Tell me exactly what happened," I said. "From the beginning, date by date. Don't summarize." He told me. 6 months ago, February, a requisition had arrived at the Aldric brothers' Foundry. Standard format, official paper, war procurement header. The order was for 40 tons of iron casings, Class 4 ecclesiastical tolerance, the grade used for heavy artillery shells, hollow cylinders with flanged mounting rings. The Aldric brothers made them routinely. They were perhaps a third of the Foundry's military production. The payment terms were standard. The delivery window was standard. The specified tolerances matched the Ordnance Commission's current requirements exactly. The only element that deviated from the standard process was the destination. Rather than the usual Fort Alden military receiving depot, the order specified delivery to Calveaux Terminal Receiving Licensed at an address in Calveaux, with a note explaining that Fort Alden was at temporary capacity due to operational stockpiling requirements. "Fort Alden is always at capacity," Vane said. "That's been a standard routing note for 3 years. Half our deliveries in the past 2 years have gone to secondary depots. I had no reason to question it." "The authorizing signature?" He opened the bottom drawer of his desk with the specific hesitation of a man accessing something he has decided is going to cause him problems. He removed a document folder, the original requisition, protected in a heavy paper sleeve, and slid it across the desk to me. I looked at the signature at the bottom of the order. Suffect Archivon Harlieu, War Procurement Logistics, Ecclesiastical Fifth Army Command. The signature was precise and confident, with a characteristic double flourish on the final letter that I recognized from a regimental dinner 3 years ago, when Harelieu had signed a table seating arrangement with the same assured penmanship that successful senior administrators bring to every act of writing, as though the pen is merely an extension of their authority. I had met Harelieu exactly once. He had been elegant, not in a showy way, but in the way of a man whose confidence has been calibrated by decades of being right in important situations. He had white hair, close-cropped, and the bearing of someone who has never had cause to doubt their institutional standing. He had complimented my filing system, which sounds like a small thing but is, in the world of ecclesiastical administration, the equivalent of a senior officer complimenting a sergeant's drill. It means they noticed, and what they noticed was worth noticing. Suffect Archivon Harelieu did not make administrative errors. He was the kind of institutional mind that generates correct processes and then follows them precisely, because correctness is the form of authority at that level of church hierarchy. He was not the kind of man who signed an irregular requisition by accident, which meant the requisition was not irregular from his perspective, which meant he knew exactly what he was authorizing and had authorized it anyway. "This copy stays with me," I said. Vane nodded in the way of a man handing over something he had already decided was better in other hands. I spent the next 2 hours in the Aldric brothers' records. Okafor sat in the corner with her own notebook, making observations that she did not share, and that I was becoming progressively less inclined to ask her to share, because what she was noting was almost certainly what I was noting, and 2 separate records of the same conclusions were, in this situation, a form of mutual insurance. The production records were clean. 40 tons of casings manufactured to specification, quality checked at each stage, logged in the Foundry's production register with the precision of a facility that understood its output, would eventually face ecclesiastical inspection. The church's maker's mark applied at the point of manufacture, as required by the Ordnance Commission's licensing terms. Everything above reproach. The irregularity was entirely in the destination column of the shipping manifest, and the destination column was there because someone at the war procurement level had put it there. We collected what we needed and left Vane at his desk, sweating over the residue of our conversation. The forwarding manifest pointed to a transit facility in Calveaux, 40 miles east, a 4-hour drive on roads that existed primarily to serve the supply columns moving toward the front. Okafor drove. I read the manifest again. Calveaux was not a city. It was a transit junction, the kind of settlement that grows where roads cross and where there is therefore a commercial reason for things to stop, briefly, before continuing. A cluster of warehouses along the road, a small customs office with ecclesiastical registration, 2 public houses serving the drivers and haulers who passed through. The transit depot at the address on the shipping manifest was a warehouse with a hand-painted sign over the door that read, Calveaux Term. Rec. Ltd. in faded ecclesiastical font. The windows were shuttered. The door was padlocked. Okafor examined the padlock while I examined the building. The padlock was church standard grade, the kind used on military supply depots and administrative facilities throughout the campaign zone, and Okafor examined it the way she examined everything, carefully, efficiently, without expression. "Last opened approximately 4 months ago," she said, "maybe 5. The oxidation pattern on the shackle. The shipment arrived 6 months ago. Whatever came in went out within a few weeks." "Shell company," she said. "A legitimate registration, an address, the ability to receive and forward a consignment." "Yes." The Calveaux Customs office was 2 streets back from the main road, a low building that smelled of paper and mild institutional inertia. The duty officer was a small, elderly man with the specific quality of stillness that comes from 40 years of watching things pass through rather than stopping. He moved through his archives with the slow certainty of a man who knows every document in the building by feel, which is a skill I respect, because it is the same skill I have developed in every posting I have held. He found the forwarding manifest in 11 minutes. I noted the time. The Aldric brothers' shipment, 40 tons of iron casings, received at Calveaux Terminal receiving La Mande, February, had been forwarded to an entity registered as Research Installation 7, Ecclesiastical Military Projects Division. The destination address was a map grid reference rather than a location name. The authorizing signature on the forwarding manifest was different from the original requisition, a different hand, a different title. Research Program Coordinator, Penitent Engine Program. I read those 3 words twice, the Penitent Engine Program. I was familiar with the concept in its theoretical form. The penitent engine debates had been running in church theological circles since at least the 360s, the question of whether captured or sanctified demonic components could be redeployed against their origin, in the same way that you might melt down a captured enemy weapon and forge it into something of your own. The arguments on either side had the quality of theological arguments that have been going around long enough to have developed their own internal geography. The traditionalists, who found the idea of incorporating demonic components into church machinery heretical regardless of intent, the pragmatists who argued that hell's capability was hell's capability and the church's survival required any means of matching it, the canonically minded who pointed to precedent texts suggesting that properly sanctified conversion was theologically permissible, the canonically minded who disputed that precedent violently. The official church position was ambiguous in the specific way that official positions become ambiguous when powerful people want room to move. But the program was not a debate. The program was a building on a map. Okafor was behind my shoulder, reading. "Penitent Engine Program," she said. "Yes. That's not theoretical. Evidently not." "At Caldwin's Ridge," she said, her voice completely even. "Before the fog came in, one of our battery observers filed a contact report. Something moving in the church line, our own line. Something moving like the things that came through the fog later, but going the other direction. We filed it as observer error under stress." She paused. The report was removed from the battery log before the inquiry. I carefully folded the forwarding manifest and placed it with the requisition order in my briefcase. "We need to find Research Installation 7, I said. Sister-Archivist Maren Veth found me before I found the installation. The timing was not coincidental. She was waiting in the lobby of the customs office when I came downstairs. She had been there for some time, judging by the arrangement of her papers on the lobby table and the small cup of tea that the duty officer's assistant had clearly brought her at her request. She had made herself comfortable in a space that was not hers in the way of a professional visitor who understands that comfort signals confidence. She was perhaps 28, slight, with a careful stillness in her posture that I recognized as the physical expression of a person who has learned to watch without appearing to watch. Her church intelligence insignia was small and correctly placed, the kind of identification detail that you would see if you were looking for it, and miss if you were not. Her papers were already in her hand when I reached the bottom of the stairs. Sister-Archivist Maren Veth, Ecclesiastical Intelligence Service, War Procurement Oversight Division, investigating supply chain irregularities in the Calveaux Transit Corridor. Very pleased to coordinate with a field investigation already underway. She was not pleased. She was professionally disposed toward coordination while simultaneously and with complete efficiency building her own record of everything I had found and everything I knew. Her expression was the expression of someone who has decided to be warm and is being warm with precision. "Castigator Krell," she said, in the way people say it when the title means something they have not chosen to say directly. "The hero of the drain." "The paperwork somewhat overstated the situation," I said. "Paperwork rarely overstates," she said. "It usually describes things with particular precision at particular moments. A beat. You've been in the archives. Audit requirements." "Of course." Her eyes rested on my briefcase with the quality of attention I have learned to recognize in people who can read the shape of documents through a closed case. "Did you find the forwarding manifest?" "I found several documents of potential relevance." "Wonderful." The warm smile, genuinely pleasant and entirely unconvincing as an expression of genuine warmth. "I wonder if we might share notes. It would be more efficient than duplicating effort." I thought about the requisition order in my briefcase, Harelieu's signature, the forwarding manifest. The words, "penitent engine program" on a customs record in a transit junction 40 miles from anything. "I'm still collating," I said. "Once I have a clearer picture of the full scope, I'd be happy to liaise through formal channels." She looked at me for precisely 1 second longer than the conversation required. "Of course," she said. "I'll be in Calveaux through the weekend. The church liaison office has quarters on the canal front if you need to reach me." We separated with the mutual pleasantness of two people who had just conducted a careful negotiation in which nothing had been said, and a significant amount had been communicated. Okafor fell into step beside me on the way back to the lorry. "Intelligence," she said. "Yes." "Building her own case file?" "Almost certainly." "Do you trust her?" I turned the question around, as I habitually do with questions that have obvious answers that are also wrong answers. Trust is a word that is used to mean several different things. I trusted Veth, to be honest, within the constraints of her professional interests. I trusted her to be competent. I trusted her to file a complete and accurate report when she had all the pieces. I did not trust that her interests and mine were aligned, and interests, not character, are what determine whether another person's actions will benefit or harm you. I trust her to be exactly what she appears to be, I said, which is someone who will make very good use of whatever I give her. Research installation. 7 occupied the site of a disused mining operation in the hills northeast of New Antioch, and the approach road had been improved for heavy vehicle use and then given a deliberate impression of not having been improved. Dead brush had been scattered across the gravel surface. Road markers had been removed. Trees had been trimmed back to allow wide clearance, but then left untended enough to suggest the clearance was natural. It was professional concealment work. Not quite professional enough, but professional enough that you would have to be looking specifically for the access road to find it, which was presumably the intent. We drove in on a grey afternoon, the hills brown and bare around us, the sky low and opinionless. The installation appeared through the last stand of trees as a cluster of low, solid buildings arranged around a central processing hall. The remnant of the original mining operation, a high-ceilinged industrial structure with reinforced walls and roof supports designed for the weight of industrial machinery. A perimeter fence, church-standard wire with prayer chain woven at intervals, which in addition to its theological purpose, is an effective early warning system against anything that responds to sanctified metal. 2 guards at the main gate, properly uniformed, who examined our papers with the cautious professionalism of people who had been told that external visitors were possible but not certain, and who therefore treated every visitor as both expected and unexpected simultaneously. They called through on a signal line. We waited. The gate opened. Program Coordinator Tesseval came out to meet us himself, which I noted. A man who comes to the gate himself, rather than sending a subordinate, has made a decision about how to handle an inspection. He had the look of a man who had known an inspector was coming, the specific composed quality of someone who has been preparing their account and has decided what it will and will not contain. He was middle-aged, careful, wearing the vestments of the Ecclesiastical Military Projects Division with the ease of long familiarity. He shook my hand. He looked at my commendation ribbon. He said, "We were told to expect an audit," and looked at me with the expression of someone who means something more specific than an audit. "By whom?" I said. "By the War Procurement Office." "Naturally. I'll need to see your operational records, Coordinator, particularly anything relating to the February delivery from the Aldric brothers via the Calveaux transit facility." He took me inside. The processing hall had been converted. The word conversion understates what had been done to it. It had been transformed systematically and at considerable expense into something that was not entirely a workshop, and not entirely a laboratory, and not entirely a chapel, but that partook of all three. The space was 30 yards long and 20 wide, lit by church-grade luminaries that cast the cool white light used for precision work, the light under which you examine small tolerances and fine gradations and things that require exact vision. Along the walls were benches carrying ecclesiastical precision tools, the high-tolerance measuring gauges, the sanctified cutting instruments, the grade-marked assembly frames that the Ordnance Commission requires for Class 4 manufacture. In the center of the space were several larger freestanding frames, iron rigs designed to hold a large assembly in place while work was performed on it. Most of the frames were empty. Most of them. The one in the far corner was not empty. What it held was perhaps 60% of a completed thing. An armature, an incomplete structure that would have been, when finished, approximately 8 feet tall, with proportional width and the particular mass distribution of something designed for movement under load. Church iron, definitely. I could see the poor quality, the ecclesiastical casting tolerances, the Aldric brothers' standards evident in the surface finish and the flange geometry. But inside the church iron framework, fitted with evident care and considerable craft, were components that were not church iron, that were not church manufacture. That had the quality that I had learned from years of post-battle paperwork involving recovery and salvage operations to recognize as demonic in origin. A quality of wrongness that is not visible as wrongness, but is experienced as it. A sense that the objects in question occupy their space with slightly too much presence, as though they are aware that something is perceiving them and are adjusting for it. I stood at the edge of the workshop floor and looked at the incomplete prototype and felt the specific stillness that arrives when you are looking at something your mind is already processing but hasn't finished interpreting. The penitent engine program, I said. Yes. Tessival's voice had gone flat in the way of someone whose rehearsed account is encountering the reality of the person they are delivering it to and finding the rehearsal insufficient. The program has been operational for 14 months. The mandate came from War Procurement Logistics. I know whose signature is on the originating documents. He nodded once. The theoretical basis, he said, has been argued in church theological circles since the 360s. Suffect Archivon Harelieu is. The Archivon reviewed the existing theological arguments and the practical military situation, and concluded that the church's position justified, that the need to match Hell's mechanical capability warranted. Tessival, I said. The assault beasts at the drain. He was quiet. The assault beasts at the Battle of the Drain, I said again, with the patience that I have calibrated specifically for use on people who know something and are deciding whether to say it. 12 feet tall, iron casings, churchmakers' marks, specifically the Aldric brothers' mark, which is the mark on every piece of iron in this room. The silence that followed was structural. It held up the words on either side of it. The prototypes were taken, he said. He said it quietly, with the specific exhaustion of a man who has been carrying a sentence for 3 months and has finally been given a legitimate reason to put it down. Taken. 3 months ago, overnight. The security logs. There was an incursion. We lost 4 guards. The records from that night were, someone with access cleaned the security records. We didn't know the full scope until the morning shift. By then, the prototypes were gone. How many? 4. Complete, operational units. We had been doing final calibration. They were ready for field testing. All 4 were taken. And deployed at the drain. We believe, yes. The drain engagement was 6 weeks after the theft. The physical description in the recovery reports is consistent with our prototype specifications. I looked at the incomplete thing in the frame. The church iron and the demonic components, half assembled. The church's attempt to answer Hell's mechanical capability with the same capability, converted and sanctified and recontextualized. The idea that had been theologically argued since the 360s, made physical in a building in the hills northeast of New Antioch, and then stolen. Hell had walked into this building, had taken 4 operational prototypes, had studied them, and had deployed them against the army they had been built to fight. The assault beasts at the drain, the things that had come through the western wall of the drainage works and torn through the first 2 sections, that I had stood next to the wreckage of, in the mud, that I had seen the maker's mark on. They had not been Hell's weapons. They had been the Church's weapons. Hell had stolen them, understood them, and returned them through the front wall at velocity. The catastrophe of this was not primarily military. It was theological. The penitent engine program had been, in the minds of everyone who had designed and built it, a righteous undertaking. The conversion of Hell's own tools to God's service, sanctification through repurposing, the inversion of the enemy's capability. Whether this was heresy or genius had been argued for 60 years without resolution. But Hell had now participated in the argument by walking into the facility and taking the work. Hell had seen what the Church was trying, and Hell had replied in the most efficient possible language by taking the prototypes and using them. Which meant Hell understood the Church's approach to this innovation well enough to have infiltrated the facility that was developing it, stolen the product at the critical moment before field deployment, and deployed it first. Hell had the blueprints. Hell had the methodology. Hell had seen the tolerance specifications and the assembly process and the demonic component integration approach. The Church's most sensitive attempt at offensive innovation had not just failed. It had provided the enemy with a detailed map of how the Church thought about the problem. I thought about Harelieu, his signature on the requisition, his name on the authorizing documentation, a man who had reviewed 60 years of theological debate and concluded that the need was urgent and the position was defensible and the security implications were manageable. A man who had been genuinely wrong about the security implications in a way that had resulted in 63 prototypes. 4 completed, 2 in final assembly, the rest at various stages, being available for an enemy incursion to locate, evaluate, and partially remove. He was not a traitor. Treason requires intent, and Harelieu's intent had been entirely in the direction of giving the Church a decisive military advantage. He had been catastrophically reckless about the security of the facility. He had approved a program without apparently asking hard enough questions about what would happen if the program's security failed. He had, through a combination of genuine conviction, institutional authority, and insufficient imagination about the enemy's capacity to respond, indirectly handed Hell the methodology of the Church's most sensitive weapons development project. That was not treachery. It was recklessness at a scale that made treachery seem almost straightforward. Because at least with treachery the intent is legible. The distinction, I knew with complete certainty, would not save him if it appeared in a report. Harelieu's name on a document describing what had happened here would be read by men whose institutional function is to find a person responsible, and the person responsible is reliably identified as the person whose name is on the relevant authorizing documents. Intent does not appear in institutional accountability processes. Intent is an argument made after the fact by advocates in circumstances where the advocate's skill is the primary variable. And if I wrote the complete and accurate report, there was the additional consideration, the one I found most directly relevant to my continued well-being, that complete and accurate reports about classified programs with catastrophic security failures have a tendency to generate institutional responses to the question of who knows about this, in the form of ensuring that the answer to that question becomes a smaller number. I spent another hour with Tessival, reviewing what he was willing to say on the record and filing the rest in the cabinet of things I understood without having written down. He was cooperative in the way of a man who has already decided that cooperation is the only available position and who is trying to manage how much cooperation becomes how much of a record. We drove back through New Antioch in the late afternoon, the hills grey and brown behind us, the industrial skyline resolving on the horizon. Okafor drove, I thought. You know what you found, she said. Yes. Are you going to put it in the report? I'm going to write a very careful report. Careful how? Careful in the way that a report needs to be when the truth is more dangerous than the investigation. She drove for a time. A vehicle passed going west. A supply lorry with its canvas sides down, moving toward the front with whatever it was carrying toward the people who needed it. The things at the drain, she said. The assault beasts. Yes, they were ours. They were the Church's, which is a distinction. Not to the men who died. I did not answer, because there was no useful answer. She was correct. The difference between the church and the men who served it was an administrative and theological one, and the men who had died at the drain had not died as a result of a theological argument. They had died because iron moved through them, and the iron had been made here, with the church's standards and the church's marks, and the genuine conviction of the church's researchers that what they were building would eventually be used against the enemy rather than against its builders. Good intentions. The war is full of them. They do not improve what they produce when the production goes wrong. "What will you tell Voss?" she said. "That the investigation is complete and the supply chain irregularity has been identified and addressed. Nothing about the program. The program is not a supply chain question. It's a research and security question. That's a different department. And Harelieu's name. Harelieu's name is on a requisition that authorized delivery of iron to a legitimate ecclesiastical research facility. That is what the requisition says. That is what I will report." She drove for another mile before saying anything else. "At Caldwin's Ridge," she said, "I signed a revision I knew was incomplete. I've thought about that more than anything else from that day. And I'm still not sure it was wrong. The original report would have opened an inquiry into something that couldn't be explained in the terms an inquiry requires. The revision closed the inquiry, and the battery was rebuilt. 63% casualties would have become permanent dissolution if the inquiry had found what there was to find. I thought about that. "This is a similar calculation," I said. "Yes." A pause. "I just wanted you to know I understand what you're calculating." We reached New Antioch in the last of the afternoon light. I had a room at the church transit house, and the room had a bath, and the bath had hot water, and I lay in it for 40 minutes and thought about what kind of document I was going to write. The discipline of very careful writing is the discipline of understanding exactly where the accountability lives in a document and then choosing not to stand there. A well-constructed official record states facts. Every fact in it is true. Every fact has been selected with intention. The space around the facts, the interpretation, the connection, the contextual understanding that turns a sequence of true statements into a coherent narrative about causation. That space is where the accountability lives. If the space is unlit, the accountability is unlit. The document exists. Its facts are real. Its conclusions are absent. In the absence of conclusions, the reader must draw their own, and the conclusions readers draw are shaped by what they already know and what they want to believe, and the person who wrote the document is not responsible for what readers choose to believe about it. This is not dishonesty. This is professional drafting at its most disciplined. I sat at the small desk in my room, dry and warm, and took out a clean sheet of ecclesiastical paper, rag pulp, official watermark, and my best pen, and I wrote, "I confirmed the supply chain irregularity. The Aldric brothers' foundry had diverted a consignment of 40 tons of iron casings to an unauthorized transit facility at Calveaux, on the basis of a war procurement requisition processed through standard channels. The transit facility had been used as a forwarding point for materials subsequently delivered to an ecclesiastical research installation northeast of New Antioch. The installation's program of work had been reviewed and found to be operating under established ecclesiastical military authority. The maker's mark observed on equipment recovered at the drain engagement was consistent with production from the Aldric brothers' foundry, and this finding had been referred to the relevant program authority for assessment. The supply chain irregularity at the point of manufacture had been identified, documented, and the matter referred to the authorizing authority for resolution. No evidence of external diversion of church material had been identified at the point of manufacture. That last sentence was the most carefully constructed of my career. At the point of manufacture, the Aldric brothers' foundry, there had been no external diversion. The diversion had been internal, institutional, authorized. What had happened at Research Installation 7 was not a supply chain failure. It was a security failure. It was a different kind of failure, belonging to a different administrative category, requiring a different kind of report from a different kind of official with a different set of institutional responsibilities. I was not that official. I named no one. I specified no program name. I made no interpretation. I described no specific finding beyond what the supply chain audit's formal scope required. I read it back 3 times, which is 2 more times than I usually review a document, because this one needed to be right in a way that most documents do not. Then I wrote it out again on a second sheet for the ecclesiastical archive record. Then I burned my notes. The private notes from the installation visit burned cleanly in the small fire grate, curling and blackening the specific calculations and observations I had made while Tessival talked, the record of what I had understood in the room with the unfinished prototype. The customs records from Calveaux existed in the customs office's own archive, and presumably in whatever Veth had copied. Those were not mine to burn, but my interpretation, the analysis I had assembled around the facts, the understanding of what the program had been and what it had given away. That was in my notes, and notes are a personal professional document, and destroying them was a professional discretion, not evidence tampering. I put the briefcase on the bed and sat across from it for a while. The requisition order from Vane's files, the forwarding manifest from the Calveaux Customs office, Arlu's signature, the grid reference of the installation, the name of the program. I should have burned them with the notes. The careful version of this decision burned them with the notes. I opened the briefcase and took them out and held them. Not leverage. I want to be clear about that, for my own internal record if for nothing else. Leverage is a strategy, a considered plan to deploy information against a person in a specific future circumstance. What I was contemplating was not a strategy. It was an insurance policy, which is a different instrument. An insurance policy is what you hold when you are standing at the edge of a situation you do not fully control, and you want to ensure that, in the event of things going wrong in the wrong direction, you have a material that can demonstrate your position. The war had become more complicated. The penitent engine program was not going to simply stop existing because I had written a careful report that didn't name it. Tessival's facility would continue to exist. The unfinished prototype would continue to sit in its frame, 60% complete, waiting for a decision about whether it would be finished or dismantled. Arlu would continue to occupy his position in war procurement logistics, signing requisitions, managing the supply chain, genuinely believing that what he had done was necessary, and that the catastrophic security failure that had followed it was a separate and recoverable problem. Veth would continue building her case file. She was good at her work. She would find the path eventually. She had the customs records. She had the manifest. She would find the grid reference. Whether she had the administrative reach to get through the program's security classifications was another matter, but she was church intelligence, and church intelligence had reaches I did not know the shape of. And at some future point, in some future configuration of events I could not currently predict, the distinction between knowing something and being known to know it might matter. Not as leverage, as context, as the difference between a man who understood what had happened and can demonstrate that understanding, and a man who is described by others as having understood it in whatever way serves their current purpose. I put the documents in the inner pocket of my document wallet, into the strongbox, into the footlocker, locked it. The morning was grey and smelled of coal smoke, and the transport was ready at 6. Okafor was beside it, map folded, engine running. She handed me a cup of something that was technically tea, in the sense that it had been in proximity to a tea leaf. 7 hours back, she said. Rode through the valleys holding. We drove back through the landscape in reverse. The same checkpoints, the same supply columns moving west, the same rear area installations with their organized purposefulness, the familiar world of the Crusade's logistics, an army maintaining itself in the field, the 1,000 daily acts of supply and communication and maintenance that keep the thing at the front alive and supplied and connected to the institutions behind it. I watched it, and thought about what it meant that the institutions behind it were capable of funding a classified weapons program using diverted military iron and a shell company in a transit junction, and that the program had been infiltrated and its products stolen and deployed against the very army it was meant to serve, and that the official record would, if my report stood, contain nothing about any of this. The rear areas were full of men who believed they were fighting a war against an external enemy. They were. They also were not. The drain had been fought with church weapons, in a sense that none of them knew. The men who had died had been killed by something their own institutional hierarchy had built. The distinction between the church and hell, which was supposed to be absolute and metaphysical and ontological, had been made briefly permeable by a combination of ambition and inadequate security and the enemy's evident intelligence capacity. I did not know what to do with that. I knew how to write a report about it. I was less certain I knew how to think about it. Voss read the report in silence. He turned the pages with the methodical attention of someone who is reading every word, which is actually quite rare. Most reports are skimmed by the people who receive them, the significant details absorbed, and the remainder filed. Voss read it all, and when he finished, he set it down and looked at it for a moment before he looked at me. "The irregularity has been addressed," he said. "As described. The authorizing authority has been notified." I noted the specific word. I had written referred, not notified. There is a difference. Referral implies transmission. Notification implies receipt and acknowledgement. Voss was paraphrasing my document with a slight upgrade in certainty, either from habit or intention. I did not correct him. "The referral is on record," I said. Those two eyes again, looking at me with the full attention of a man who is deciding something. "The maker's mark," he said, "is consistent with Aldric Brothers' manufacture. The relevant program authority has been advised, as noted." A long silence. From outside, the percussion of distant ordnance, one of the permanent background facts of the forward position, the guns maintaining their interminable correspondence. "Is there anything you want to tell me off the record, Krell?" The most honest question anyone had asked me in 4 days. The question that, from Voss, meant, "I know there's more. I am offering you the opportunity to tell me informally what the report cannot contain. I am telling you by asking that I will receive it informally and use it appropriately." The question that would, if I answered it, involve me in a conversation that did not have a paper trail between me and Voss, about a program that officially did not appear in my report. A conversation that would exist only in memory, which meant Voss's memory, which I could not control. "The supply chain is intact at the point of manufacture," I said. "The irregularity was an internal matter referred to the appropriate authority. My report covers the scope I was given." Voss held my gaze for 4 full seconds. Then he nodded, once, with the particular quality of a man who has received precisely the answer he expected. "Well done, Krell," he said. I thanked him and left and went back to my desk and found 17 dispatches in my in-tray, all requiring the signature of a senior castigator. I signed them without drama. Supply authorizations and personnel transfers and prayer ammunition requests and a censure notice for a corporal in the 7th who had apparently been selling church rations. All of it necessary. All of it the invisible bedrock on which the visible parts of the war are built. The pens, the ink, the paper. My hand moving across document after document with the practiced efficiency of someone who has been doing this long enough to have a signature that comes out the same every time, which is itself a professional accomplishment, the physiological record of consistency. I thought, while I signed, about the men who had died at the drain. Holt's 9th. The men I had filed paperwork for afterward, the casualty forms and the personal effects inventories and the notifications to families. I had not known any of them well, which is a professional habit rather than a personal failing. You learn in this work not to know people well, because knowing them well means knowing them in the full weight of their presence, and then the paperwork afterward is not a form, but a reckoning. They had been killed by church iron, sanctified iron, carefully manufactured to ecclesiastical tolerances, assembled around demonic components by people who believed genuinely that what they were building would protect the church. The chain of intention ran from Harelieu to Tesseval to the Aldric brothers to the assault beasts at the drain, and every link in the chain was made of reasonable decisions in reasonable circumstances, and the result was Holt's 9th. I signed the last dispatch and put my pen down. The thing about the war, the thing that nobody in the official documents acknowledges and that takes years of reading those documents to fully absorb, is that it is not one war. It is many simultaneous wars that share a geography and a theology and an enemy, and yet do not fully communicate with each other. There is the war at the front, which is physical and immediate. There is the war in the supply chains, which is logistical and chronic. There is the war in the ecclesiastical councils, which is theological and generational. And there is the war in the documents, the reports and manifests and requisitions and program authorizations, which is administrative and essentially invisible, which nobody fights consciously and nobody wins cleanly, but which shapes everything else. I had just fought a small battle in the documentary war, and had produced, as my outcome, a report that told a truth that explained nothing. It was a professional achievement. I was not certain it was a good one. That night, in the small hours, I opened the footlocker. I took out the document wallet, the requisition order, and the forwarding manifest, folded, slightly worn at the crease from having been handled. Harelieu's signature, the grid reference, the name, Penitent Engine Program. I held them for a while and thought about all the things they represented, and all the things they did not say, and all the things they would say if shown to the right person in the right circumstances. Then I put them back, into the wallet, into the strongbox, into the footlocker. Locked. Not leverage. Documentation. Evidence that the things which had happened had, in fact, happened, maintained by someone who had been present, against the possibility that the institutional record, the careful, deliberately incomplete institutional record I had just contributed to, proved insufficient to the truth when the truth eventually required space to move. The truth has a way of requiring space to move. It is patient. It sits in ledgers and manifests and requisition orders, in forwarding documents filed in a customs office, in a transit junction, in the operational records of a classified facility in the hills. It waits, and eventually, someone competent enough to read it, and unfortunate enough to understand it, goes looking, and finds it. I was that person this time. I would not always be there to receive it. The footlocker would be. The guns talked to themselves in the dark. The wind moved through the sandbags. The forward position breathed around me. The nocturnal sounds of a military installation that has been in one place long enough to develop its own rhythms. 6 weeks ago, I had pulled a detonation cord because the man holding it had bleeding hands, and there was no time for a better idea. They had given me a commendation for it. The commendation had made me useful to Voss. Voss had sent me to New Antioch. Moulhaven had shown me something that the official record was not going to contain, and that I was not going to be able to forget, and that was now locked in my footlocker along with the most consequential paperwork I had accumulated in 20 years. I was still alive. The war had become more complicated. I had been told, very early in my career, by an ecclesiastical administrator who was old enough to have been in the service before I was born, that the 2 things you needed for a long career in church administration were a good filing system and the judgment to know which things to file and which things to put somewhere else. I had a good filing system. I was developing, I thought, the judgment. The footlocker was somewhere else. The campaign would continue. The dispatches would keep coming. The forms requiring the signature of a senior castigator would accumulate in my in-tray at their usual rate, and I would sign them, and they would go into the system, and the system would use them to do the work it does. Ordnance manifests, and supply requests, and personnel transfers, and the 100 other administrative acts that constitute the visible surface of an army in the field. Underneath that surface, somewhere in the hills northeast of New Antioch, the unfinished prototype sat in its frame at 60% completion, waiting for someone to decide what to do with it. Somewhere in Calveaux, Veth was building her file with the meticulous ambition of someone who understood that the file was a route to something she wanted. Somewhere in the war procurement offices along the canal front in the Moulhaven District, Harelieu was signing documents with his characteristic double flourish, doing the administrative work of the crusade with the genuine competence of a man who had spent his career doing it well, not yet knowing that his most ambitious project had already produced its consequences, and that those consequences were at present confined to one footlocker, one customs archive, and whatever Veth had assembled in a church liaison office on the canal. Not yet knowing. But the documents existed. Documents have a habit of being found. The war is full of things that are waiting to be found. I keep good notes until the moment I burn them. I keep better copies in a footlocker under lock and combination. That is, in the end, the only honest summary I can offer of everything I know about 20 years in the service of his eternal church. I was there. I understood what happened, and the evidence is in the footlocker. The rest of it, the bodies and the smoke and the iron moving through the drainage works, the assault beasts that were the church's own machines come home, the 63% of the 6th Artillery who did not walk out of Caldwin's Ridge. The rest of it will need a different kind of account, written by someone braver or more reckless or more certain of their position than I am. I am a castigator. I file forms. I notice things, and I choose very carefully what to do with what I notice. I noticed the maker's mark at the drain. I should have burned that observation too. I'm glad I didn't.